Welcome to the Content 10X Podcast, the show where content creators learn how to harness the power of content repurposing. And now, your host, Amy Woods.
Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the Content 10X Podcast. I'm your host, Amy Woods, and this week on the show, I want to share with you some of my observations from attending Podfest event in Orlando. So at the time of recording this show, I was at Podfest only a week ago, but we recorded a little bit in advance. So Podfest was probably a couple of weeks ago. If you're listening to this the week it goes out, it was on March the 7th to the 9th in Orlando, and it was a really great event. It was about bringing together and supporting and helping lots of different content creators. Now, obviously by the name Podfest, the main focus was on podcasters and the podcast industry, but there was also quite a lot of focus on video content as well. There were some well-known people in the YouTube space, like Roberto Blake was there delivering a talk, and I spoke to a lot of video creators and live streamers as well as podcasters. So it felt really good to meet all sorts of different people creating different content, but like I said, with a main focus was on podcasting. Now, I've mentioned on the show before that I was talking at the event, so I did a talk on podcast repurposing, which I'm sure doesn't come as a surprise to you because repurposing really is my speciality, and I spoke all about how you can repurpose podcast episodes with a real focus on connecting with different people and looking at the different ways that people learn and connect with content. So that went really well, and for the first time ever I had a booth in the exhibition hall at the event as well. So we were exhibiting there. We had our banners and our leaflets and our comic book about content repurposing, and it went really, really well. So it was great to just meet so many different people. Really good event. I really do recommend it. Now, I would say that one of my biggest observations in speaking to so many, particularly podcasters, but so many content creators, was around how people were not all that focused on the distribution of their content and on making sure that the great content that they create is actually going to have the best chance of reaching people. So what I mean by that is there were so many people putting out a great amount of time into creating good content. And there was such a broad spectrum of topics as well, from quirky interview shows to golf podcasts, dating, live streams, all sorts of topics. And it was really commendable to hear that people were consistently creating really good content, that they were putting a lot of thought and time into. But more often than not, my conversation would go along the lines of, great, so you've got a podcast, so where is it distributed? And people might say to me, well, it's on SoundCloud, or well, it's only on iTunes at the moment, and so on. And so some people even said to me that they had a podcast and it was only on their hosting site and nowhere else. And it kind of started to frustrate me a little bit, not their fault, but more just that there's sometimes perhaps the lack of awareness of just how important it is to make sure that your content is distributed as far as it can, and that it's not that much extra work or that much extra time to make sure that you increase the distribution channels. Well, why is this a problem and why was it frustrating me? But just imagine if you had a podcast and you only had it on iTunes and nowhere else. So there are loads of people who use iTunes or Apple Podcasts, but what about the simplest of things, that not everybody has Apple devices? And if you don't have an Apple device, then you don't have the Apple Podcasts app on your phone and you aren't listening to Apple Podcasts, meaning you don't stand any chance of actually finding that person's podcast episode. So the podcaster is immediately restricting their distribution just by the fact that they are only on Apple Podcasts or only on iTunes. But if you have a podcast where you are on Apple, iTunes, whatever you want to call it, also Android app, you're on Spotify, you're on Stitcher, you're on iHeartRadio, maybe you're on Anchor as well, it's free. So if you really, really do increase your distribution, then you're going to reach a much bigger audience. And we're not even talking about repurposing here. We're just talking about increased distribution. Now, this doesn't just go for podcasters. If you have a blog, a video vlog, if there's anything that you could do to improve distribution, then I really think it's worth having a think about that, because some of the steps can be really simple, even just a one-off step to submit your podcast RSS feed or your blog feed to a few extra places, and then your content will just automatically go to those places and you'll reach more people. Now, the other thing that really surprised me, and as I mentioned, it was a very positive experience. It wasn't that I was really frustrated with people, but something that really surprised me was that people didn't actually complement their video and audio content with even the shortest of show notes or the shortest of written content. So many people told me that they created their video or their audio. I'm sure it was really great, really good quality, but all that they would do would be upload it. So to, their video or their audio host, they would upload it and then move on to the next piece of content. So this is before I even start kind of talking about social media distribution and promotion. A lot of people didn't even do just that short write-up. So just an introduction and even just some bullet points telling people what the video or the podcast was about. So I guess it really surprised me, because I'm so focused on turning content into other forms of content myself. But I think, that might mean that I do always have that laser focused view of content and always looking at how you can get the most out of it. And I appreciate that's the lens that I tend to see things through. But I think written content is so important for getting found by the search engines. Even just writing a short title and just, like I said, some bullet points really does help you. And then let's just forget about search engines for a moment. Even if somebody finds your content by any way whatsoever, they find you on Apple Podcasts, or they find you on Spotify, or they find you on YouTube, wherever they find you, if you have a short write-up that someone can just find out what is in it for them. So that could make or break whether they consume your content, because we all assess what's in it for us. That's totally normal. Time is precious. When we're choosing whether to consume content over another piece of content or just doing something else in our lives, then helping people to make that decision only helps you as well. So they were the two kind of really big observations. As I said, I won't even talk now about people who perhaps weren't making the most of social media, because I think that's another episode in itself. But these were the two kind of simplest things, really. So I really wanted to round this up by saying that I was really inspired no end by how many people were creating great content and they were really dedicated to it. But there were a lot of people who were putting so much time into the great content, but just not enough time into working out how they were going to get people to find it and decide that they would consume it as well. So if I could leave you with an actionable takeaway from today's episode, before we even think about repurposing, then let's just have a look at our core content and look at its current distribution channel. Just work out, could you make some simple steps to improve the distribution of that content? So if you're a podcast, are you on all of the apps? If you create video content, where are you posting it? And could you just go further with where you post your content? And if you write articles, again, where do you post them? And could you be more widely distributed with the articles that you create? And are there just some simple one-off steps that could improve that distribution? So that's what I want to kind of leave you with today to have a think about for your own content. So thank you so much for listening to today's podcast episode. I really do appreciate it. If you enjoy the show, then please don't hesitate to leave me a review. I would really appreciate that on whatever podcasting app you listen to this on. And also, please do follow me on social media at Content10X on all of the social media channels. So all that's left to say is thank you so much for listening to today's podcast episode, and I'll catch you in the next one.